Hey guys, how's it going? It's Soundkiller, and today I'm going to show you something really awesome because I'm going to show you my attempt on recreating the Skrillex growl, and this is basically showing my growl chain for the growl sounds that I use in my music. So, without talking much longer, let's go into our DAW and get started with this tutorial. So here I have my Growl project, and what I do here is I have this fun little project here where I just draw different notes and different patterns here, and then I just render out the growl that I want for my song. And for the growl, as you guys can see, I'm using good old FM here with Sytrus, and I'm gonna explain to you guys all the magic. But first, we're using Sytrus, and then we are doing some post-processing here. Nothing too complex. I'm gonna explain each and every instance and every plugin that I'm using in detail so that you guys know what I am using, so that you guys know what everything does and why I am doing it. And so this is the growl that I'm going to be showing you guys. And it's really meaty, it's really full, it has a bit of, it is very mid-present, it has a lot of energy, and it's very vowel, so it's really powerful growl. It's really awesome in music because it's so full that you don't really need to layer it with much else because it covers the whole frequency spectrum, which is what I wanted ideally for a growl, because I wanted to be the meat of the sound. I want it to be like the present sound when it's playing. So I'm gonna start by showing you guys here what is happening here with our Sytrus. And as you guys can see, it looks really complicated, but I promise you it is actually not. And there's only two important things happening here. And the first thing to note is that operator 1 is barely having any output. So if I move it here, it barely has a 10% output. And oscillator 1 is set to a 1x multiplier, and that is basically our sub. So this is only just outputting a raw sine wave, which is acting as the sub layer for our growl. Operator 2 is multiplied by 2, so now we have a ratio of 2 here, and it has around 8% input into operator number 3. So we're going from operator 2 into operator 3. And operator 2 is just a basic triangle wave. Operator 3 is a basic sine wave here, and it has a ratio of 3. And now something very interesting that's happening here in operator 3 is that we have a modulator here, so it is being modulated by modulator X, so that it gives that movement of the growl. And that is being added here with this curve, so that when I move the X position here in the modulation, it changes the amount of frequency that is being input by operator 2. So this just changes. This is basically how in Serum you can add a modulation in FM from B, and you can control how much FM from B you are doing. Then this is the equivalent of that in Sytrus. Now we go into operator 4. So interesting enough, before I go into operator 4, I'm basically on this patch using 3 operators, and they are being routed in filter 1, as you guys can see here. So this is very important for me to explain first before I go into operator 4. And so basically this is like the volume knobs for each of the operators that I'm using. So I already told you guys that I have 10% of the sub here with this one over here on operator 1. But now if we go here on operator 3, we have around 50% of volume for operator 3. And now our next operator is operator 6, which is our next modulated. So instead of jumping from operator 3 into operator 4, first let's look at operator number 6. Operator 6 is also a basic sine wave here, and it has a ratio of 2 just like how operator 2 had the ratio of 2 is also happening. And we also have the modulator X. And the operator that goes into operator 6 is operator 5. So this curve is controlling the amount of operator 5, so the FM from 5, let's call it that. How much of that is going into number 6? So number 5, there's something really cool happening here, and we're starting to do some more complex shapes here. And so we're sort of using a triangle wave, but we're sort of skewed it a little bit. So you guys can see, we sort of drag that skew a little bit, just a teeny amount. And again, we're using a ratio of 2. And now finally we can go into operator 4, which is our last operator. And operator 4 is going into operator 5. Operator 5 is going into operator 6. And so operator 6 is just a triangle wave, but not fully triangles. It's around like 20% of the shape here. So it's sort of like half sine wave, half triangle happening there. And all of these are routed into filter number 1. And filter number 1 is a bandpass filter that is controlled by the modulator X. So when I move the modulator X, and if I disable all the effects and play the sound here, and see the spectrum here on the oscilloscope, that's our raw sound. And that is a combination of operator 3 and operator 6 going into the filter here. So it has a really nice bandpass filter. And we also have a deep chorus being added here with the effects here. So as you guys can see, I think this was the default chorus effect that I added into the mix here of the growl here in Sytrus. And you guys might be thinking, well, Soundkiller, how did you turn that sound into what you created? And basically, when you're creating growls, that bandpass filter, so that really low, really muddy sound is what's going to actually create you the growl. And it's very important when you're creating this is that you add a lot of resonance here. So I'm using 34% resonance because that's what's going to really create your growl tone. One last little detail that's really awesome to know when creating growls is that instead of using a mono sound, I like to add 3 voices, and I found that 3 voices is like the perfect amount because you have the left voice, the right voice, and the center voice, and creates a really even and really thick sound. And you don't have to use a lot of detuning, so I'm using just 13% of detune, like just 30% volume, so it's a really subtle detuning effect, but without it, it sounds completely different. And once we show you the post-processing, after all the post-processing, I'm going to show you the difference from not having the 3 voices of unison compared to the actual 3 voices. So now that I showed you guys the whole Sytrus patch, we can now move on and go one by one here with the post-processing. And so I'm going to start off with this really awesome plugin, which is a free plugin that you can download at fullbucket.de, which is called Frequency Shifter, Full Bucket Frequency Shifter. And it is what you guys are reading. This is a frequency shifter. And the really awesome thing about this frequency shifter, and the reason that I use it, is because it creates some really cool artifacts in the tail of the growl. And so I have it super subtle. So I'm just using a 0.3 hertz frequency shifting. So that's basically nothing. It's basically not shifting at all. And I'm barely using any. So it's like 91% dry and 9% wet. And then over here, it's 5% wet. So it's a really not there. But it's really present with the artifacts that it creates. It's really aggressive. And without it, it just sounds less artifacty. It doesn't have that high end present that it adds. And right now, you guys can't hear it because it's not doing anything, because the actual plugin that does all the heavy lifting is this patcher preset that I created that has 3 OTTs, just like straight up OTT. Nothing changed with those OTTs, just 3 OTTs set to 100%. And that's basically the secret sauce to creating meaty growls. So with that, it's starting to sound close to that final result. And if I disable the frequency shifter, you guys notice the lack of artifacts. And it's very subtle, and I can increase here so you guys can see how aggressive those artifacts can get the more I increase the mix level, or the wet knob as you guys rather call it. After that, I have here a EQ, and this EQ is very simple, but it does a really important job. And it is to lower the volume of the sub bass here, because we're using the integrated sub from our patcher. Because we're using the sub that is coming out from the Sytrus, so I wanted to mix it in with the growl and wanted to balance it out. And I was taking and turning down a little bit the high end so that those artifacts don't pop and peak as much. After that, I added a serum effect, and this serum effect is mostly just to widen the sound a little bit, which is what this hyper is doing. It is very subtle, it's just adding a little bit of more stereo information. And I also really love the sound of this phaser here that has serum. So I set it to the mix at 50%, I set it to around 1000 Hertz, and I'm using the 36 plus phaser. And it really makes a difference in the tone of the growl. It adds an extra vowel, so it sounds like it has more harmonics. It sounds richer and fuller, at least to me and my ears. I then added some more EQing, so now I'm boosting the low mids and I'm taking a little bit of the high mids here. So I'm just really subtly shifting the sound to get the tone that I really like. It's sort of like pre-mixing here. After I added a second phaser, and again I'm doing sort of the same thing that I did here with the serum effects. So I added a cutoff at around 1000 kilohertz. Again, I added the order of 3, and again 50%. And to me, it makes it sound deeper, it makes it sound fuller, it makes it sound richer. Now I have some more EQing here. Again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm taking a little bit of that low mid area. I like, and I tend to remove instead of adding frequencies, because by removing, I'm not increasing, I'm not changing the volume of the sound as much as if I started adding, then it would clip. I'd rather have it be a little bit quieter, and then when I add the OTT and the distortion, that boosts the volume quite a bit. So a good rule of thumb when mixing and when sound designing is to cut instead of adding, because this gives you headroom to boost the sound a lot more. And I did add it very subtly a little bit of the high end that I removed before, because I found that after the phaser, I needed a little bit of the high end. After that, I added a really subtle OTT, so it's only at 18% of depth, and it doesn't have any upward compression happening here. And it is basically just gluing together the sound, so it's not as dynamic, so it's very, very, very sausaged. And the final key element of this recipe for this growl is having this kilohertz distortion plugin. And this is a fantastic, and I could say it's my favorite distortion plugin. And it is a free plugin, so you can download this for free at Kilohertz website. And I really like to use this saturate mode here because it's very aggressive. So I go and I add 9 decibels of volume. And this is very important, how I was telling you guys that cutting instead of adding. This is because I rather cut, because I'm adding so much volume here that it won't really hurt me for me to cut in the EQs before this one. And I added a little bit dynamics, so it's at 40% because I want it to really be a sausage. I don't want it to be dynamic. I want it to be a really thick, really present in your face, really loud growl. And so all together, it sounds something like this. And if I take out the distortion, you can see how it really makes it meaty And to compare once again, I'm going to disable all the effects. And now, as promised, I'm going to show you also the difference from not having the unison. It sounds a little bit crunchier, it sounds a little bit more crunchy, meaty. It sounds a little bit more crunchy, but I feel it's a little bit less meaty, and I really like that stereo information on my growl. So I'd rather sacrifice the crunch for that stereo information. And it also sounds more moved. It feels more rich. It feels fuller to me, if you guys can't tell. Both are fantastic growls, and I can also disable here the chorus. And everything is so subtle when you're adding things to the growl. So for example, if I disable the operator 3, it's very subtle, sort of mid-high area that is touching. And if I disable the operator 6, you can see what that area is playing with. I can disable the sub here, and you can see how that is playing, and really doing subtle changes here on these operators. So for example, I can play around with this triangle, maybe have it to be closer from a saw. And it sort of really changes the sound, especially if you play with the main sound here. So it's really just like experimenting and playing around. And something that I really like to do is that every time I do a change to my growl, I like to render it and save it into a sample folder. So that way I have a collection of different growls that I can use, and that way I don't feel bad when changing, because I don't actually use this preset in my tracks. I rather use the sample and just play around with it. And so I have a separate project, which is what you guys are seeing right now, for my growls, so I can really go and like just play around and manipulate it and just have a fun little session of just playing with this particular growl. And it can go really crazy and change the tone here completely by just changing the ratio amount. So I can turn it from a growl into a FM bass. Especially if I change operator 4 here. So it's a really fun sound design session, just playing around and just moving slightly and subtly each knob and seeing the results, and just creating a huge folder of variations of growl sounds here just for your music production. So that's a really awesome thing that I encourage you guys to do when creating growls. Instead of adding the growls to your track, just take a day in your production session to just create a bunch of growls and create a bunch of samples for your personal sample library. And you can do this with any sounds. If you're just designing some wobble basses, FM basses, any kind of sound design, where you can go really crazy and really play around and see what everything does, and create so many samples that you can use for when you're feeling creative and have an idea for a track. You already have all of these ready to go sounds that you can just drag and drop into your track. And of course, if you're not inspired, if you're not the type to sound design and create, there's people like me that dedicate their life to creating sounds. So you can check out blacklotusaudio.com, because we specialize in sound design and we want to give you guys the best sounds possible. blacklotusaudio.com has everything you need to produce songs with really high quality sounds like the one that I just showed you guys. So if you guys want some premium dubstep sounds, definitely check out blacklotusaudio.com. So there you have it. This is sort of like a really awesome growl masterclass where I showed you the really detailed analysis on how to create growls, and I showed you the behind the scenes on the meat and the bones of a growl sound. If you guys really like this video, you should definitely like and subscribe, and you should definitely comment what kind of sound design and what kind of tutorial you want to see next and what you guys want to see break down. This was Sound Killer. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.